All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something, well, a little unnerving, to be honest. Could gold actually save the U.S. dollar?
It's a question a lot of folks are asking these
It
days.
it really is. So we're going deep on this article from Numismatic News
Oh, yeah, I saw that one.
by Patrick A. Heller. Could gold save the U.S. dollar? Published just a few days ago, December 26th, 2024.
Very timely.
It is. And he really doesn't hold back, paints a pretty stark picture of the country's financial, well, health.
Yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat it. What's fascinating is that Heller really lays it out there, plain and simple. We might be staring down a financial crisis.
Exactly. And it all boils down to, well, debt.
Mountains of it. Government debt over $100 trillion.
$100 trillion. It's hard to even imagine, right?
And that includes what they call unfunded liabilities, things like Social Security and Medicare.
Stuff that impacts everyone listening, right? Their purchasing power, their future.
Absolutely. And Heller gets right to the point. He talks about the budget deficit, almost 7% of GDP. That's huge.
And he even goes back in history, compares us to, well, empires that crumbled under similar circumstances. Rome, the Netherlands, Spain, the UK, even the Soviet Union.
It's a sobering thought, for sure. What really struck me is when he pointed out that our interest payments on this debt are actually exceeding what we're spending on defense.
That's wild. We're spending more on interest than on our military.
Yeah, and historically, that's a big flashing red light.
Makes you sweat a little, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So where does gold even fit into all of this?
Right. Well, there's this economist, Judy Shelton. She's proposed a potential solution, this 50-year U.S. Treasury bond that would be backed by gold.
So we're talking about like a return to a gold standard.
Kind of. The idea is to restore confidence in the dollar, tie it to something tangible.
I see, but wouldn't that basically tie the government's hands? Like they couldn't just print money whenever they wanted anymore?
Exactly. It's a pretty radical solution, and that's where Heller's skepticism comes in.
He doesn't buy it.
He's not convinced. He argues that, tying the dollar to gold isn't a magic bullet. It might actually create more problems than it solves.
He brings up the fact that, well, the U.S. hasn't always kept its promises when it comes to gold.
Right. Think about the 1933 gold confiscation. Not exactly a shining moment in our financial history.
Definitely left a mark. And he points out that, the dollar's purchasing power against gold has just tanked over the last 53 years.
Oh, yeah. Back in 1971, a dollar could get you a decent amount of gold. Now, not so much.
So even if we wanted to go back to this gold-backed system, would we need an insane amount of gold to cover our current debt?
That's another one of Heller's concerns. Our gold reserves are just a drop in the bucket compared to the national debt and those unfunded liabilities we talked about.
Like, we're trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun.
Pretty much.
So it sounds like a gold-backed system might not be the easy answer some people are hoping for. What else is making Heller raise an eyebrow?
Well, there's the issue of ownership. Heller actually suggests that a big chunk of those U.S. gold reserves, they might actually belong to Germany.
Wait, really? We might not even have as much gold as we think.
Exactly. And then you have to factor in the political reality. Does Heller think politicians would ever agree to significantly raise the dollar price of gold?
Which would be necessary to make any of this work.
Exactly. He's doubtful, to say the least.
So even if we wanted to do it, it might not even be possible.
That's what Heller seems to be saying. And even if we somehow pulled it off, would investors trust it?
We have a bit of a track record of, changing our minds on this kind of thing.
It's a lot to ask people to just believe that this time it'll be different.
So, okay, if tying the dollar to gold is such a long shot, what does Heller think is going to happen?
He thinks that even if a gold-backed bond offered some temporary relief, it's not going to stop the dollar's decline in the long run. He even suggests that countries like China and Russia, with all their gold reserves,
They've been stockpiling for a while, haven't they?
they have, and they might just introduce their own gold-backed systems, which would further weaken the dollar's grip on the world stage.
Wow, we're talking about a potential currency shakeup on a global scale. That's a pretty big deal. What could that even mean for us?
It's huge, and it really underscores how complex this whole global financial system is. But, even sticking with the U.S., there's another dilemma Heller brings up, this inherent conflict between a gold-backed system and, well, the government's tendency to just spend, spend, spend.
It's not exactly breaking news that our government has a spending problem, but how would a gold-backed system actually change that?
Well, it would force a hard limit, right? You can't just create more gold out of thin air when you need it.
I see. It would force them to be more disciplined.
Exactly. A level of fiscal discipline we haven't seen in decades.
So is that a good thing? I mean, would it force them to make tough decisions, get our financial house in order, or would it just lead to more gridlock and chaos?
That's the billion-dollar question. Some economists see it as, a necessary evil, the only way to rein in runaway spending and get back to a more stable system.
And others.
Others are worried that it would be a political nightmare. It could lead to even more instability and potentially cripple essential programs.
So even if a gold-backed system sounds good on paper, the reality could be much messier.
It seems like Heller's saying that no matter what we do, a decline of the dollar is practically unavoidable. Is there any way to dodge that bullet? He seems to think that a gold-backed system might buy us some time, but it's not a cure. He's predicting other countries will start rolling out their own gold-backed currencies, and that's going to chip away at the dollar's dominance. But this isn't about doom and gloom.
It's about being realistic.
Exactly, acknowledging the reality and, adapting to it.
So then what can we do if the dollar is on shaky ground and a gold-backed system is a Band-Aid at best? How do we protect ourselves?
Well, remember what Heller said. Consider physical gold and silver as a kind of wealth insurance.
So diversifying your portfolio, adding assets that have historically held up well, even when currencies have, tanked.
Think of it as a safety net for your finances.
It does make you think. It's a lot to absorb, and I get our listeners are wondering what a shift away from the dollar could mean for the world as a whole.
It's a big question, and I think that's where we need to head next.
You're right. But before we go there, let's dig into what Heller has to say about what individuals can do to prepare.
He really emphasizes that idea of physical gold and silver as a hedge against a declining dollar. It's about having something tangible, especially when things feel uncertain.
So diversifying, finding assets that have held their value over time, even when currencies have failed.
Exactly.
It's a lot to think about. I know our listeners will want to hear more about what this potential shift away from the dollar could mean on a global scale.
Absolutely. We'll dive into those global implications after a quick break.
So we were just talking about this potential decline of the dollar. It's pretty clear that Heller sees some trouble ahead. And it's not just a problem for the U.S., is it? The whole world is kind of holding its breath, watching what happens to the dollar.
You're right, it's a global issue. And Heller really zooms in on China and Russia.
Yeah, they've been making headlines with their gold strategy, haven't they?
For good reason. They've been quietly, but very deliberately, building up these massive gold reserves.
So what does that even mean for the average person? Someone listening right now, why should they care what China and Russia are doing with gold?
Well, imagine a world where the dollar is weak, but China and Russia have these strong, gold-backed currencies.
Makes them look pretty good, right?
Exactly.
Oh.
Suddenly, they become a much safer bet for investors all over the world. And that kind of shift could completely change the balance of power, economically speaking.
So you're saying there's a chance that this whole gold situation could actually benefit our rivals more than it helps us?
It's a real possibility, and it highlights just how interconnected these global financial systems are.
It's kind of unsettling, to be honest.
It is. But let's bring it back to the U.S. for a second. Heller brings up another dilemma, this inherent conflict between a gold-backed system and, well, the government's love of spending money.
Yeah, it's not exactly a secret that our government likes to spend. But how would a gold-backed system change that?
Well, it would impose a hard limit, wouldn't it? You can't just print more gold whenever you feel like it. Tying the dollar to gold would force a level of discipline, fiscal discipline, that we haven't seen in a long time.
So is that a good thing? I mean, would it force them to get serious about our finances, make some tough choices, or would it just create more gridlock and chaos?
It's the big question, isn't it? Some economists think it's the only way to get our spending under control, like a necessary evil, get things back on track.
A tough love approach.
Kind of. But others are worried that it would be politically impossible to pull off.
Too much resistance.
Yeah, and it could lead to even more instability, maybe even hurt essential programs that people rely on.
So it's a gamble either way.
It seems that way. Even if it sounds good in theory, the reality could be a lot messier. It feels like Heller's suggesting that no matter what we do, the dollar is headed for a decline. Is there any way to stop that from happening?
He seems to think that a gold-backed system might buy us some time, but it's not a permanent fix.
Right. He's predicting that other countries will catch on, they'll start introducing their own gold-backed currencies, and the dollar will slowly lose its dominance.
But he's also saying we need to be realistic, right? This isn't about doom and gloom.
Exactly. It's about recognizing what's happening and figuring out how to adapt.
So what can we do? I mean, if the dollar's in trouble and gold is only a temporary solution, how do we protect ourselves?
Remember Heller's advice? Physical gold and silver. Think of it like an insurance policy for your wealth.
So diversifying your investments, adding assets that have a history of holding their value, even when currencies crash.
Exactly. It's about having something tangible, something you can hold on to when everything else feels shaky.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. I mean, it's not like we're talking about bartering chickens for eggs here.
Yeah.
We have this whole complex financial system.
You're right. But this system, it runs on trust and stability. And right now, both of those things are, well, they're in question.
So gold and silver, it's not about ditching the system. It's about having a backup plan.
It's about hedging your bets, taking control of your own financial future as much as you can.
I can see why that would appeal to people, especially with all the uncertainty in the world. But is gold the only option? What about those other types of currencies we hear about?
You mean things like cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, and those local exchange trading systems, even barter networks. People are getting creative.
It's pretty fascinating how people are finding new ways to exchange goods and services outside of the traditional financial system.
So even if the dollar does decline, it's not necessarily the end of the world.
Right. There might be other ways to adapt and thrive. People are already thinking ahead, coming up with solutions.
It's almost reassuring, It shows that people are resilient.
Absolutely. It speaks to the human spirit, doesn't it? Our ability to innovate and find a way forward.
Okay, so we've talked about gold, alternative currencies, but it feels like all of this comes back to one fundamental problem, this massive, unsustainable government spending. Is there any way to fix that?
That's the question, isn't it? And honestly, I wish there was a simple answer. Some economists are pushing for big changes, structural reforms,
Like overhauling things.
Things like entitlement reform, simplifying the tax code, getting rid of unnecessary regulations, promoting free trade. It's about creating a system that encourages responsible spending, sustainable growth.
That sounds like a huge undertaking. Do you really think it's possible to make those kinds of changes?
It's not going to be easy, but I think it's necessary.
It's got to start somewhere, right?
We need a real shift in mindset, both from our leaders and from everyday people. We have to start thinking long term, even if it means making tough choices.
So this isn't just about pointing fingers at the government or waiting for someone else to fix things.
It's about taking responsibility for our own financial futures and demanding more from our leaders.
Holding them accountable.
Exactly. And that's where education comes in. The more we know, the better decisions we can make, the more we can hold our leaders accountable.
This has been eye-opening for sure, a lot for our listeners to think about. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on Heller's final point. He says that even gold, it's not a foolproof solution.
He's right, Even if you diversify your portfolio, even with gold and silver, there are always risks.
We can't control everything.
Exactly. There are things we can't predict, like political instability, social unrest, natural disasters.
So it's not just about having the right investments, it's about having the right mindset.
Being adaptable, being resilient, being prepared for whatever comes next.
And that's a good message for just about anything we face in life, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about facing uncertainty with knowledge and courage.
And taking action.
Yeah, shaping our own destinies.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground here. We started with a question about gold and the dollar, and we ended up exploring the foundations of our entire financial system.
And it's pretty clear that there are no easy answers.
But we can make informed choices.
By understanding the challenges, by exploring different perspectives, by taking action.
It's about empowerment, right?
It is. It's about shaping a more stable and prosperous future.
That's a good place to leave it, I think. So, we've explored some pretty heavy stuff, some, unsettling possibilities about the dollar. But as we wrap up, I think the big question hanging in the air is this. If gold can't single-handedly save the dollar, what other solutions are there?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, right? And there's no easy answer. But I think to even start tackling it, we have to acknowledge the root of the problem. It's the spending. It's the government spending. It's out of control, and we're racking up this unsustainable debt.
Like building a house on a foundation of sand.
Exactly. Eventually, it's all going to come crashing down.
So cutting spending, that's got to be part of the equation. But how do we actually make that happen? I mean, the political climate, it just doesn't seem likely.
It's a huge challenge, no doubt. It would require a complete change in thinking, Politicians, voters, everyone would have to be on board.
A real commitment to, what, fiscal responsibility,
Uh,
long-term planning?
And probably some tough decisions.
Yeah.
Things that might not be popular, but are necessary for the long haul.
Okay, so let's be realistic. That's probably not happening overnight. What are some other options? What if cutting spending alone just isn't enough?
Well, some economists are advocating for deeper changes. They call them structural reforms.
So like fixing the underlying problems.
Things like, entitlement reform,
Uh-huh.
simplifying the tax code, getting rid of all these unnecessary regulations, promoting free
It's
trade.
not just spending less.
Yeah. It's about spending smarter, creating an environment where the economy can actually thrive, not just survive.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, right?
Uh,
Cut back, make smarter choices, and create a system built for real, sustainable growth. But even if we could do all of that, isn't there still a risk that other countries, especially with their focus on gold, they might just zoom past us?
There's always that risk, for sure. But remember, economic power isn't a fixed pie.
It's not like if they win, we lose.
Exactly. The U.S. still has a lot going for it, a diverse economy, an entrepreneurial spirit, a history of innovation.
So it's about adapting.
It's not about clinging to the past. It's about evolving and figuring out how to thrive in the future.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they try to navigate their own financial futures?
Be informed, be proactive, and be adaptable.
Good advice for life in general.
Stay informed about what's happening in the economy. Consider different viewpoints. And make choices that align with your own financial goals.
Don't panic, but don't stick your head in the sand either.
Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand these complex systems, the better equipped we are to deal with them.
And even in uncertain times, there are still opportunities.
Absolutely. It's not about predicting the future perfectly. It's about being prepared for whatever it might hold.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we started with gold and the dollar and ended up diving deep into the whole global financial system.
And it's clear there are no easy answers.
But we can be informed. We can make smart choices.
By understanding the challenges, by being open to different perspectives, by taking action.
It's about taking control, right?
It's about creating a better future.
I like that. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little empowering.
And until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep exploring.
That's the spirit.